From San Francisco, New Dimensions Radio presents The Wisdom of Joseph Campbell, featuring the distinguished mythologist in conversation with host Michael Toms. These intimate radio conversations, recorded between 1975 and 1987, reflect the personal friendship they enjoyed, as well as their mutual appreciation for ideas and the world of myth.
Hello, I'm Michael Toms. Of the thousands of hours of conversations New Dimensions Radio has recorded over the years, none were more engaging or fruitful than the hours I spent with Joseph Campbell. And in this series, you'll hear why. In recent years, of course, Professor Campbell's work has achieved a popularity far beyond what he knew in his lifetime. But his efforts to find modern meaning out of ancient myths and restore a sense of mythic interpretation to a secular world go back more than half a century. His professorship at Sarah Lawrence College, where he taught for 39 years, became a base for his intellectual quest. The artifacts he left behind, including his groundbreaking books, The Masks of God, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, The Mythic Image, and the Historical Atlas of World Mythology, are landmarks pointing the way to restoring the sacred to modern life, which has become spiritually barren for so many. In this series, we will hear Joseph Campbell articulate the nature and meaning of many important mythic themes to be found throughout the world's cultures: the call of the hero, the vision quest, death and rebirth, humans and nature, and many others. In the conversation which follows, recorded in the fall of 1980, when Joseph was 76 years old, he discusses the role of myth in more general terms, laying the groundwork for our journey together. I was impressed over and over again in our meetings by his childlike enthusiasm and excitement over new discoveries he was experiencing, such as his visit to the Picasso exhibition in New York. I began this conversation by asking him for some mythic insights about the dark recesses of the human psyche and human society. Joseph, welcome.
Thank you, Michael. As always, pleasure to be with you.
It's good to be with you as well. Joseph, in the introduction, I referred to the darkest places in the forest of society. And perhaps a good place to start is to recall that those dark places have always been with us down through recorded history, haven't they?
They have indeed. And those are what are symbolized, actually, in the forest adventurers of the Grail. And there's a wonderful statement in The Quest of St. Graal. That's the version of the romance in which Galahad figures. The knights are challenged by Gawain to go in quest of the Grail, to behold it unveiled. And the text says they decided to do so. But they thought it would be a disgrace to go forth in a group. Each entered the forest at a place that he had chosen, where it was darkest and there was no way or path. As to say, each must find his own path. Following a path, you're following someone else's destiny. And one of the great, I think, spiritual insights of the peculiarly European Western tradition is that each of us has his own destiny and just doesn't run along an already mapped out track.
So often we see those dark places as huge problems in our life, whether we view our life as an individual or our role in the overall society. And we relate to it as a problem as opposed to an opportunity. What does mythology say about that?
Well, I would say that mythology tells us that where you stumble, that's where your treasure is. There are so many examples, for example, in the Arabian Nights, of someone, let's say, plowing a field, and his plow gets caught, and then he digs down to find what caught it, and it's a ring of some kind. He hoists the ring, and down below is a cave with all of the jewels in it. And so it is in our own psyche. Our psyche is the cave with all the jewels in it. And it's the fact that we're not letting their energies move us that brings us up short. And so it is. The world is a match for us, and we're a match for the world. And where it seems to be most challenging is where the greatest invitation lies to find deeper and greater powers in ourselves.
So we need to push ourselves.
Right. Toynbee, in his history work, speaks of challenge and response, and every culture as well as individual runs into these challenges. And if the power to respond fails, then that's the end. But where the power to respond succeeds, there comes a new amplification of life and consciousness.
We seem to be in the place, both individually and societally, of reacting as opposed to responding, as you mentioned, in the sense that if you look at history, just in the past 20, 30, 40 years, one can look at the present and see the same mistakes were there just 10 years ago, and yet we seem to still be reacting in the same way. How can we move into that response mode?
Well, in a personal life, as well as in culture history, there are what might be called cliches of response that become established. I remember as a young man, I'd fall in love in a certain way and then think to myself, well, how am I ever going to get out of this particular situation? And get out of it, and 3 weeks later would be in the same situation with someone who had blonde hair instead of brown. The circumstances seem to change, but the cliche is in one's psyche. And what you have to come to is a new level of understanding of what your relationship to life might be. That's the creative act. But your word is entirely correct. We're responding instead of creating.
Or reacting.
Reaction instead of action.
Yes.
But action requires an innovation.
Yeah.
I noticed writing. You could say this the way you said it before, but then it would be the same thing, that inertia. On the other hand, every sentence is a challenge to say it anew, and the anew is a totally new statement, really. So it is in living life every day.
Sometimes we're afraid of the new. The new is almost like a threat to our well-being. And that's kind of the way it's been down through the ages, hasn't it?
Right, and you're also afraid of being criticized. It's a sticking your neck out. That's what life is. And this is what every minute requires. And in any kind of creative work, painting, writing, music composition, or inventive action, you're sticking your neck out. And the symbol of the Star of David, the two triangles. Well, this symbol occurs also in the Sanskrit tradition in India and is placed in the center of the heart. And what it represents is the upward pointed triangle effort to move toward the spiritual call of the new innovating experience. The other represents the inertia that calls you down to what was done before and the way it was done before. And it's that new thing that's life. Life is always new. There's a growing point. And where you're not at the growing point, you have become more or less a robot. That's the wasteland. People living not in terms of innovative thinking, but in terms of how it was done successfully before.
I recall, as you're talking about innovative thinking and doing things anew, and in James Joyce's book, Ulysses, in one of your books where you were saying where you first came in touch with that book, and you was, how do I read this?
Yes.
And you were talking to a friend, I believe, and
yes.
and I think that's an example of what we're talking about.
Yes.
And I'd like to hear, your experience, that initial experience of James Joyce, and then how you learned the symbology. And
well, I was in Paris as a student of medieval languages, Old French, Provençal, Middle High German, and so forth, and so on. And Joyce at that time, this is back in 1927, 28, Joyce was not known in this country. His Ulysses wasn't permitted in this country. And we had no idea that he had already begun work on the wild thing that was to come out as Finnegan's Wake. So I went into a bookstore, and there was the blue Ulysses, avez-vous Ulysses, mais oui, monsieur. So I got the Ulysses, and I started reading this thing. At chapter 3, I thought I was going crazy. I went around to Shakespeare Limited on Place de l'Odéon, which is where Sylvia Beach, who had published the book, was. And I walked in as an indignant academic person saying, how do you read a thing like this? And she said as follows, and she gave me some information and some books to help me on my way. But talking about innovation, is that not an innovation? innovation. Every single chapter is a totally new innovation, and there's no repetition of anything, and this moves right on through Finnegan's Wake in grand style. This winter in New York, the big thing, for me at any rate, was the Picasso exhibition, 4 miles of pictures by this man. And at the age of 16, he produced 2 paintings which were of academic perfection. He got into the academy by passing the exam when he was 13. So what do you do with your life if you're producing academically perfect works at the age of 16? And every step thereafter was an innovation. Every step, as you go from one room to the next. He was like the growing point, as it were, the growing point of the whole 20th century pressure of art into new regions. Terrific.
It's interesting as we're talking about art and innovation, how our society essentially sees art in the area of the humanities and explorations and innovations as kind of a sideline to the mainstream of life. The mainstream of life being business, getting on with business, getting on with the real things. What about that?
Well, I think one of the feelings today is that we lack roots. That wonderful poem of Yeats, The Second Coming, where he says, turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. I think we feel that in ourselves, we feel it in the society. Where is the revelation? Well, revelations in the past, all the great scriptures, have come from poets and artists. I mean, these are the ones who hear. These are the ones whom we call seers. And it's the function, really, of the poet and the artist to do exactly what Joyce and Picasso have done. Push on into spiritual realms that are waiting to be found, because our life situation is so radically changing all the time. When you think of earlier centuries, from I'd say around 2000 BC, when the agricultural societies became firmly established, to the middle of the 18th century, we had basically an agrarian world, with the same social orders and the same essential technical problems. And then suddenly everything begins changing. And when you think what's happened since that time, man has been completely displaced from the old ways. And the old systems don't talk to us, really. We try to understand, but we don't feel it. A revelation is not to be explained to you. It's to be immediately experienced with an aha, oh, that's it. And that's the poet's job. That's the artist's job. So I think they're the burning point. The business world is, for the most part, dealing with solutions that have already been achieved, working them out. But even there, we see them in trouble now. They don't know how to handle these new situations. So there's revelation to be rendered on every level of our life. Economic, political, social, emotional. It's a new world we've built for ourselves, and we have to learn to know it.
So the nature of our society is almost inhibiting to creativity, and yet we hear a lot about being creative, and wherever you walk, you hear about, well, I'd like to be creative. I'd like to be more creative. And in a sense, the way we approach our life and the way living in a modern society with all of its technology and the tremendous emphasis there is on rational, linear, logical thought processes, all of which have brought us great blessings as well. At the same time, we've gotten out of touch with that deeper side of ourselves, and perhaps the questions we ask and the problems that we present to ourselves as being so insoluble are really questions that go to a deeper root that lies in mythology, in the mythology of the world.
Well, the value of mythology in the old traditions, one of the values was that every activity in life had been mythologized. You saw something of its relevance to the great mysteries and your own participation in the great mysteries in the performance, in agriculture, in hunting, in military life, and so forth. All of these were turned into spiritual disciplines. Actually, they were. There were rituals associated with them which let you know what spiritual powers were being challenged and evoked and brought into play through this action. Well, now, as I said before, our society has changed so fast that we have not had a chance to find what we're doing. And consequently, it's up to every single individual in his own life to analyze his psyche in relation to his life task. And if he finds it isn't working, well, then getting an income from that task isn't worth it. You've got to risk in order to find life. And people go into a work just thinking, well, this will make money for me, not thinking, gosh, this is what has inspired me to life action. They have to face it in the end and find some fighting way to turn their work into a creative experience.
Joseph, have you ever done anything in your life primarily for money?
No, absolutely not. Well, I would have, I think, but I came back from my student years in Europe in 1929, just about 2 weeks before the crash. And I didn't have a real job for 5 years. And I found then, I don't know whether it would work now, but I found then that a young man, unmarried, didn't need money. I could pretty well take care of myself for almost nothing. And then I took a little vow that I'd never work for money because I've enjoyed myself just enormously, reading what I wanted to read and so forth. I dropped my work on the PhD because it would have required me to do things that I had already outgrown. In Europe, the world had opened up, as I said earlier, Joyce, among other things, but more than that, Sanskrit and the Orient and the relationship of all of this to psychology and all, and I couldn't just go back to finish up that PhD thesis, and I wouldn't do it. Besides, I didn't have the money to do it. And just that freewheeling maverick life gave me a great sense of the deep joy in doing something that meant something for me. And then I found when I finally, after 5 years, was invited to teach at St. Lawrence College, that they were very much excited by what I had found I wanted to do. And I would not have taken the job if they would not have let me do that, just as I wouldn't take the PhD. And, well, I had luck. I had luck. I don't know how it would have been if I had been married at that time already with a child, let's say. That's something else. I can't speak to that point. But it wasn't by accident that I wasn't married and didn't have a child, because it was my notion that before anything like that, I should be prepared to take care of the situation.
Wasn't there a myth that says you create your own luck?
That's not only a myth. There's a wonderful paper by Schopenhauer called An Apparent Intention of the Fate of the Individual. And he points out that when you are at a certain age, well, kind of age I'm at now, and look back over your life, it seems to be almost as orderly as a composed novel. And just as in Dickens' novels, little accidental meetings and so forth turn out to be main features in the plot, so in your life, funny little accidents and what seemed to have been mistakes at the time turn out to have been directive crises in the life. And then he asks, who wrote this novel? You see, and you can ask yourself, it's as though it were planned, and there is something in us that's doing this. People speak of people accident-prone. It's something in themselves. They could even be in the car with you and you doing the driving, and it's not good to have them there, you know. So there's a mystery here. And Schopenhauer finally asked the question, can anything happen to you for which you're not ready? You don't know whether it can. I look back now on certain things that seemed to me at the time to have been real disasters, but the results of it having been a disaster instead of a success turned out to be the structuring of a really great aspect of my life and career. So what can you say?
Joseph, in our society, fairy tales are for children. What about the fairy tale for the adult? The fairy tale for the whole person?
Well, that's a good question. Most of the fairy tales are for children. Those that we like best usually represent a stopping at a threshold. The child doesn't want to grow up, you know? One of the problems in a neurosis is that the person hasn't grown up, hasn't moved from a position or attitude of dependency and expecting an authority into that of assuming his own authority and responsibility. And so, insofar as many adults haven't made that step, those children's stories are for them. But I think the later fairy tales for the adult individual are those of our religious traditions. The teachings of the Buddha, the teachings of Jesus, the teachings of Zoroaster. I think these can be read as fairy tales. And what a fairy tale is, really, is a story that is not regarded as being true in the sense of being a historical truth. It's not a fact truth, but it's true in the way of an inward truth, as a reference to one's own inward life. And if one reads the scriptures that way, not as references to history, but as references to one's own spiritual interior and its potentialities, then they are, as it were, fairy tales for adults. That's what I would say.
There are many millions of people that, for instance, with the Bible, interpret the Bible literally. There was a great flood. There was a Garden of Eden, et cetera, et cetera. There was a fall. What about that literal interpretation of the Bible?
Well, that literal interpretation of the Bible faces the problem of scientific and historical research. And we know that there was no Garden of Eden. We know that there was no universal flood. And so we have to ask, really, what is the spiritual meaning of the Garden of Eden? And what is the spiritual meaning of the flood? Interpreting biblical texts literally reduces their value. It turns them into newspaper reports. Do you know of things that happened long, long ago, and so what? So there was a flood, so what? But if you can understand what the flood means in the way of reference to spiritual circumstances, the coming of chaos, the loss of balance, the end of an age, and the end of a psychological posture and so forth, then it begins to talk to you again.
Making the connection to myth, many people, I think, who interpret the Bible literally have perhaps not been exposed, or at least have not seen that there are many other similar texts from other cultures down through history that make the same reference points, talk about a deluge, talk about a paradise, and you find this throughout cultures all over the planet.
Well, there's no doubt about it. There was a great German anthropologist, Adolf Bastian, Bastian, who was the first really to make a big point of noting this, that there are motifs, there are themes that occur in all the mythologies and all the religions of the world, with very few exceptions. And he called these elementary ideas. And where did they come from? They don't come from the fact world. They come from the psyche, just as fairy tales do. And now that you brought that theme in, I think we can play with it this way. Then he observed also, of course, that in the different provinces of mankind, they occur in different inflections, different costumes according to the place and time. And these he called ethnic or folk ideas. Well, these are the two sides of our subject. The folk idea is a historical problem. Why do we have this form here and that one there? But the elementary idea is a psychological problem, a very deep psychological problem. And I've noticed that in India, there are two words that refer to the same two aspects of mythology. One is deshi, which means local, provincial, the provincial, local aspect of the myth. And the other is marga, M-A-R-G-A, which means the path. And the meaning of that is that by casting off the shell, you might say, of the local, historical, provincial inflection, one comes to the elementary idea, which is the path to guide one to one's own inwardmost heart. The word marga comes from a root that means the trail or path of an animal. So you follow the animal, you might say, of the spiritual guide to your own inwardness. That's what myths are good for. And when you follow them, then all the great traditions are talking to the same point.
I think Christ's message, in a very real sense, was that each of you has this power. Each of you has you have your own capacity to realize this.
Well, indeed, and that comes out even more strongly than in the canonical Gospels. In the Gospel that has recently been translated, the Gospel according to Thomas, where Jesus says, "He who has heard and assimilated my word is as I." And that's good Buddhism. it's an important thing to realize that it's right in you. And I think that's one of the things that the Oriental teachers over here are telling us. Now, of course, we're getting the quintessential thing of those Oriental teachings when they come over here. If you were to go to the country where they came from, you'd find a lot of local, deshi, provincial material roundabout that would be just as much an encumbrance as the equivalent over here. And so we're getting the real spiritual message. And what they're telling us is that the spiritual teaching has a spiritual, not a historical, concrete reference. My friend Heinrich Zimmer once said, the best things can't be told. The second best are misunderstood. The third best have to do with history, biography, and all that. Now, the vocabulary through which the best things are told as second best is the vocabulary of history, biography, and so forth. But they don't refer to history and biography. They refer through this to the transcendent. Deities have to become, as one great scholar now in Germany says, transparent to the transcendent. The transcendent must shine through them, but it must shine through us too, and through the spiritual things that we're talking about. And as long as you keep pinning it down to concrete fact, and say, oh, this isn't true because it didn't happen, you're wrong. And we don't say that about a fairy tale, and so we get the truth of it. We should read our religions that way.
In the conversation